Welcome to all the English superheroes. My name is Chantal Oliphant, and today we are going to focus on how to approach novels, right? Let's move on. Let's look at our lesson in the curriculum scope. So remember, we're still focusing on reading and viewing, but we're going to specifically look at language features as well as comprehension skills. All right, now remember, it's about reading the novel and interpreting what's happening. Our comprehension strategies for literature includes the following. The literary interpretation to develop a sense for a deeper appreciation of the figurative as well as the literary meaning in text. Okay, now please take note, literary and literally is not the same thing. Literary refers to what the writer of that novel is trying to communicate. Then we can examine closely the manipulation of language as well as answering questions based on a novel. All right. By the end of this lesson, what will you be able to do? Gain knowledge of the building blocks of literature. So literature is built in a certain way. Novels are written in a certain way. You will acquire reading skills, recognize and understand interpretation questions, use the correct vocabulary to respond to these literature questions. You'll also gain techniques to answer questions as well as understanding exam questions. All right, let's look at keywords and language that you might encounter as we progress through this lesson. Symbolism is the use of symbols to present ideas or qualities. Now remember, many times novelists use these symbols to represent something deeper, all right? Manipulation of language is controlling or influencing someone or something to achieve a desired outcome. The novel needs to take this message somewhere. Then imagery is those vivid pictures, and then literal and figurative meaning. I'm sure we have encountered that. From our previous knowledge, what do we need to know? Reading skills to understand the symbols, the figurative as well as imagery. Guidelines in interpreting elements of literature. Comprehension skills for literature as well as answering questions. So what do we do in grade 12? We practice and we refine these skills with particular emphasis on interpretation questions. All right. Common errors. What do we find learners cannot do? They fail to read the novel that they study, and reading that novel is of vital importance. It is paramount. You cannot respond to questions if you don't know the content of that novel. You must be able to identify the building blocks of literature. You need to understand the sequence of unfolding events in your novel and interpret, analyze, and respond to questions. And then learners struggle to do that because it's a skill that they need to acquire, and they lack the vocabulary in order to respond to those questions. All right, let's move on. Our exam writing competencies. How do I apply these skills in an examination? All right. Remember, you need to interpret, analyze, and respond to the scope of the question. What does the question require of me? Critical thinking skills, time management, vital, important. All right. Because you need to respond in a particular time. That question paper is time bound. Your reading skills and interpreting the core elements in the literature text. All right, so these are the competencies you need in order to complete your exams successfully. Learners, that takes us to an ad break. I will see you shortly. Learners, welcome back from your little snack break. We will now dig into the comprehension strategies for literature. All right, so let's look at our first little segment of information. Literary interpretation to develop a sense for a deeper appreciation of the literary meaning in text. Now, I know it sounds like a whole lot of things you need to remember, so let's break it down for you. All right. What is the problem that we're dealing with? Remember, learners do not have an appreciation for the literature, which means in order for you to interpret, you need to understand it, you need to appreciate it, you need to know what's happening, all right? And because of that, then learners do not respond appropriately to the question that is required for the text, all right? So let's look at our first little segment here, the building blocks for literary interpretation. Where do we start? How does all of this happen? So our first one is the setting, all right? So novelists set the action in a certain place or particular place because that is going to feed into how the plot and the theme develops. So setting is the context for the time and the place where the story occurs. Our next little indentation is characters, all right? The individuals who create the action in the story, all right? So normally your characters shape how the novelist is going to develop his story. So look closely at the interaction, all right? And how the characters relate to each other. Plot is the sequence of events that make up the story, okay? So remember, we have to know the sequence of events because that is how we respond to questions as well. And timelines are very important when plot needs to be developed. Our theme is the underlying message or the main idea that the novelist is trying to convey, all right? What is the message that he wants to bring across that is captured in the theme? Moving on to conflict, all right? This is the central struggle, the problem, the challenge, all right? The issue that's being dealt with. So that we term the conflict, all right? Let's move on. Remember, we're establishing the building blocks for literary interpretation, how we interpret what we are reading. Our next point is the narrative, the point of view from which the story is told. So remember, sometimes we have a first-person narration where the novelist says, I, or we can have a third or second person narration where the novelist uses someone to tell a story from a different point of view, all right? Then literary devices, techniques to enhance the storytelling like imagery, the pictures that the novelist tries to create in your head, or the symbols that he uses, all right? So let's see if we can use these building blocks of literature to respond to a question. So we are going to look at the novel Cry the Beloved Country, all right? And it's written by Alan Paton. And Alan Paton is sending us a message. He says to you, you cannot comment if you did not read. So please make sure you read your novel well in advance, all right, to the exam so that you can answer questions based on the text. So we're going to look at three aspects of our building blocks. We're going to look at characters, we're going to look at setting, and we're going to look at plot, all right? So let's see if we can break that down. Our characters are Stephen Khumalo, James Jarvis, Theophilus Masimangu, John Khumalo, Arthur Jarvis, and Absalom Khumalo. Now, in this instance, I've just listed the characters. Remember when we went to our building blocks, we said we need to look at the interaction between the characters and how they relate to each other, because that is going to be the background for the novelist to set the plot or the conflict in action, all right? The setting. Now, sometimes novelists use different settings or multiple settings, or they just use a singular setting. But in this case, we see there's three identified, okay? So our first one is Ndosheni, which is a rural village, and this is where Stephen Khumalo lives. This setting highlights the simplicity as well as the struggles of village life. Now, please take note, we've identified the rural, for that misinterpretation there. Now, I want you to see how the novelist uses simplicity, all right? So he's trying to convey this message that the rural village is rather simplistic in the way they live, all right? As opposed to, now look at the following, Johannesburg, a bustling city that represents the complexities and challenges of urban life. Now remember, look at the contrast where your rural village is the simplistic way, close to earth, way of living, and then Johannesburg has the complexities and the challenges, all right, of urban life. So see the contrast of the rural village as opposed to urban life. Then High Place. This is a farm owned by James Jarvis, which symbolizes the contrasting lives of white landowners and the black villagers. All right, so let's move on. Our plot. Reverend Stephen Khumalo, a black priest from a rural village, travels to Johannesburg after receiving a letter about his sister Gertrude's illness. All right, Khumalo undertakes the journey, also hoping to find his son Absalom, who went to Johannesburg and he never returned. The Reverend learns that Absalom was involved in criminal activities and is now in prison for the murder of Arthur Jarvis, a white advocate for racial justice. Khumalo, heartbroken, returns to the rural village with Absalom's pregnant girlfriend. The novel ends on a note of tentative hope as both Reverend Khumalo and James Jarvis work towards a better future for their community. Now, please take note how plot is broken down into the simplest form and not very detailed, all right? But as you understand the plot, you know exactly where your novelist is going. We're moving on to examining the manipulation of language. So see how cleverly language gets manipulated. And many times, because learners cannot decode the manipulation of language, they are not able to respond to questions or cannot make logical connections, all right, as the events unfold in the novel. So let's look at how manipulation of language works. You need to use language to explain the structural elements, all right? So let's look at the structural elements. They include plot, the exposition, the rising action, the climax, as well as the falling action and the resolution of where the novel is going. The language use also involves figures of speech, rhetorical devices, which support the theme as well as the imagery. All right, language is to explain the effectiveness of the literary elements, like character, setting, theme, and plot. And language describes the narration, the way in which the story is told, and that captures the reader. All right, so now we've looked at the manipulation of language in a novel. Let's see if we can break this down, all right? Now, already we've identified our characters, Stephen and John, all right? The setting, Stephen goes to see John, which means he's traveling. He's leaving his rural village to Johannesburg. Look at the effective diction for he growled, all right? It identifies the tone, the way in which those words were spoken. Remember, we've taken a text, all right, from the novel and we're breaking it down. Look at the simile for it was like thunder that was rolling. So already there's a vivid image created in your head about what we're expecting. Look at the figurative language. He said, it is built on our backs, on our sweat, on our labor. Okay, so the language rather figuratively used there so that it leaves an impact with the reader. Okay, we're moving on. Our persuasive language, all right. For this was a new brother that he saw, all right. He sat silent, for this was a new brother he saw, which means something's different about him, something changed, all right. Remember, these are nuances which you need to pick up as you go through your text that is given to you. Remember, you're manipulating the language that the novelist is giving you. Link to the theme of racism, all right? He says, he lives in a big house and his white priests get 4, 5, 6 times what you get. So why are the white priests getting more money than his brother, all right? He's concerned about that. Look at the dashes, all right? The dashes there indicate something. What is it indicating? So let's move quickly to see if our solution can assist us. Growled is effective diction. It confirms his angry and unpleasant tone. The persuasive language, using the word new to describe his brother, means he changed. There's something different about him. The dashes indicate the extended pauses to show the conversation has become slightly uncomfortable, something that he can't deal with, all right? The setting is where Stephen went to visit goes to Johannesburg to find Absalom and Gertrude, because remember, they have now disappeared. They haven't returned to the village, and he wants to know where they are. The figurative, it is built on our backs, is their effort and sweat that made all of this possible. And the theme of racism being reinforced by mentioning the white priest and their earnings as opposed to that of his black brother priest. Learners, that takes us to a short ad break. I hope to see you shortly. Learners, welcome back from your short ad break. We will now dig into the comprehension strategies for literature, and our area of focus is going to be answering questions. So let's dig right in. What are we dealing with? What are the problems that we encounter? Remember, we need to understand and recognize the interpretation questions. We need to know what we need to respond to, using the vocabulary to respond to it, as well as gaining techniques on how to analyze and interpret these questions and respond to them, and then understanding your exam questions and how the questions need to be answered, all right? You may lose marks when this is not done properly, so that's why we need to focus on how you respond to the contextual evidence given to you in questions, all right? Now, to answer questions, you must know what to expect, all right? So this paper that you are writing on is usually about 70 marks. It is 70 marks. You will be required to answer 2 questions, all right, from this section, and each question will carry 35 marks, all right? Remember, you only have to respond to the genre that you've studied in your school, okay? The style of questions, there will be 2 extracts, all right? Contextual style questions, which means you don't have to write stories, you just have to answer the questions that is stated in the exam paper. And it's normally based on storyline, characters, symbols, and themes. And some questions will test your knowledge of the entire novel. Once again, I'm going to remind you, you cannot respond to a genre that you have not studied. Make sure that when you answer questions, you respond to a genre that you've studied at your school, all right? So remember, we're going to read and respond now, and we're using Cry the Beloved Country, okay? And the technique that we want to hone is how to respond to questions, all right? So let me read the passage quickly. He growled, and his voice grew deep. It was like thunder that was rolling. But it's not built on the mines, he said. It is built on our backs, on our sweat, on our labor. Every factory, every theater, every beautiful house, they are all built by us. And what does the chief know about that? But here in Johannesburg, they know. He stopped and was silent. And his visitors were silent too, for there was something in his voice that compelled one to be silent. And Stephen Khumalo sat silent, for this was a new brother that he saw. John Khumalo looked at him. The bishop says it's wrong, he said, but he lives in a big house, and his white priest get 4, 5, 6 times what you get, my brother. He sat down and took a large red handkerchief to wipe his face. This is my experience, he said. That is why I no longer go to church. And that is why you did not write anymore? Well, it could be the reason that, and your wife Esther? Yes, both perhaps. It's hard to explain in a letter. Our customs are different here. And Msimanga said, are there any customs here? John Khumalo looked at him. All right, so that is the text we're going to use. So let's see if we can respond to questions. So it says, choose a description from column A to match the name in column B. Now remember I said it's going to look at your knowledge of the novel as a whole. All right, so it might not be identified in this text, but it assumes that you've read the entire novel. So you need to match a name with a little definition. All right, so our names are Arthur, James, Msimangu, and Absalom. And remember, these are characters from the novel, right? So let's see if you can match them. Look at the response that is given to you. So A, the convicted murderer is going to be Absalom. Remember, it is Absalom who commits the murder, all right, of Arthur's son. Then B, a brilliant orator. Obviously, we have nothing to match that, so we leave that option, all right? We're moving on to C. The bereaved father is going to be James Jarvis, all right? He loses his son, okay? Then we have the known D, the known activist, all right, which is 3, Msimangu, all right? He is the one that's fighting and wanting to change the way black people are viewed in this novel. And then also E is Arthur, who's the compassionate priest. I remember he's the white priest in the village that was mentioned in the text. Okay, so there's our first question covered. So now you know this is what you can expect. Okay, let's move on to 1.2. Why does Stephen visit his brother? All right, now remember your why is always you need to support and give reasons why. So why does he visit his brother? Why is he going to see him? He wants to find out if his brother knows where his son might be. All right, so his son is Absalom. So Absalom has not returned to the village and he needs to know why. Or he wants to find Absalom and he thought John, his brother, might know where he was. Remember, John is in Johannesburg as well. And that would have earned you 1 mark. Okay. Question 1.3. Refer to line 1. He growled. And if you look at the reference, it says line 1. So it starts here with he growled. Then can you see the ellipsis? The ellipsis means there's a missing part. So they're not going to give you the entire quote, which means that you are going to look for the entire quote in the text itself, all right? And there we find it. So rolling was the last word. So that means it's going to focus on that area and that area there, all right? So number 1, you have to identify the figure of speech and explain why it is relevant. Now, identify simply means tell me what it is, list what it is. So this one is pretty easy to understand. But now this one here, explain why it is relevant, okay? So that means there's something hidden behind why his voice is growling. Why is it sounding like thunder, okay? So let's see what our response identifies. It says there, number 1, that this figure of speech is a simile. Now, how did you know that? There's that little hint, the like or as. As soon as you see like or as, it's a simile. When there's a direct comparison with no like or as, those ones are metaphors, all right? But when you see the like or as, remember, it's a simile. It's a dead giveaway. Now, let's move on to our second part. Remember the explaining the relevance. So in this case, why is his voice growling? Why is it sounding like thunder? All right, so let's look at it. Thunder is loud and intense, which is compared to his voice when he's answering his brother. So let's see, he growled. So if your voice is growling, there's some kind of anger there, all right? Look at the emotion coming through. And if it's sounding like thunder, there's this rolling sound of the thunder coming through. So it's the intensity because he is angry when he responds to his brother. Okay, so there we have it. We're moving on to question number 1.4. Explain the irony. Now remember, we said figures of speech, and there's a figure of speech coming through for you, all right? Khumalo's argument, let me just clear my throat, in lines 2 to 4. Okay, now remember, we must locate it in the text. So let's go. 1, 2, 3, there we are, all right? It says, but, and it is about that, all right? And where's that ending? Lines 2, 1, 2. Okay, let me just locate it properly there. Now, we need to explain the irony in those words that is built on our backs, on our sweat, every factory, every theater, every beautiful house. Why is it ironic? All right, so let's see what the answer or solution reveals to us. John tries to convince Stephen and Msimangu that black people are the ones doing the hard labor, all right? They are doing the work so that white people can live comfortably. However, John too is living a comfortable life. So John is living in Johannesburg and he has a comfortable home. He has everything going for him, all right? And yet he's saying to Stephen and Msamango, you know what, we are the ones that worked for it. And yet he is living comfortably. So can you see how saying one thing and doing something else is being portrayed in this response? And there's where the irony is contained, all right? Let's move on to our next question. 1.5, give 2 reasons why John Khumalo has stopped going to church. And it says you need to go to line 13. So this is line 15 here. So that's where we're going to locate our answer in the text. And they want 2 reasons, which means you cannot only list one. One is not going to earn you the marks. All right. So let's look at our response. And just briefly, give means you will find it in the text. Okay. So he lost his belief in the church, which means he no longer believes that the church is fulfilling why he wants to go there. And the rules of the church are too restrictive. So there's our one reason and there's our second reason. So now you know how to respond to questions where they tell you give or list reasons why. Okay. We will now be looking at our last question. All right, question 1.6. Why is the statement false? Which means they're already telling you the statement is false. All right. And what's the statement they're giving you? John's wife passed away. All right. So remember, it's going to test your knowledge of the novel as a whole. It's not necessarily in the text. So let's look at the response. The solution, John and his wife are separated. All right. And James Jarvis's wife actually passed away. All right. So the statement is false because it is not John's wife who passed away. It is James Jarvis's wife who passed away. All right. So you should be able to know that from your knowledge of the novel as a whole. All right. So this is an extract taken from Cry the Beloved Country. Okay. So let's see if we can respond to the questions. Question 1.1. Describe the time and place where this extract is set. Now remember, we're looking at 2 aspects. We're looking at time and we're looking at place, which means this question is going to allocate 1 mark for time and 1 mark for place. So let's see what our response says. The setting is Stephen Khumalo's house, all right? So already we're going to have, you're going to earn 1 mark already because you're telling them where it's set. In Ndocheni, the room in which Stephen does his accounts after the confirmation service, all right? So remember, if you mention Stephen Khumalo's house, you get the mark. If you mention that it's the room where he does his accounts, you could get the mark as well. So it's an or, all right? Or after the communal meal, or after the heavy rainfall, or when the bishop tells Stephen Khumalo of his intention to move him away from the rural village of Ndocheni. So can you see how we want time, all right, where is this taking place, and the location where this question is referring to. Okay, let's move on. 1.2. Refer to lines 1 to 2. So remember, we've got lines 1 to 2. Let's just locate ourselves in the text. This is where we're going to be going, all right? Okay. What do these words reveal about James Jarvis' character? And you have to support your answer. Now remember, when they ask you to support your answer, they want a reason, they want a motivation. So let's see how it is addressed in the text. He is caring, all right, or compassionate, or generous, as he contributes to the restoration of Ndocheni. So remember, we want to go to those lines to find our response, all right? He's giving them milk. He's sending the milk to the children, okay? Let's move on. 1.2.2. So it's also referring to line 1 to 2, and the question reads, explain how teaching the people of Ndocheni about farming and what it will benefit, what's the benefits for them? How is it going to improve their lives? And our response identifies it. It will improve their farming methods, which will result in better harvest. Remember how teaching them, so they don't have the skill, If they have the skill, then maybe it will be better. And that is identified in your response. Okay, so let's move on to another question. Choose the correct answer to complete the sentence, all right? Which means they're going to give you a statement and you have to complete that. So, the Inkosikazi who has died is. So, who is this referring to? This particular word that they've identified, lifted from the text. So, if you look for the words, all right, you will see that it says the Inkosikazi is dead. So, who is it referring to? All right, who is this reference in this case? In this case, it's referring to Margaret Jarvis, which means it is the wife of the priest who has passed away. Okay. Now, can you see, learners, you need to have knowledge of the entire novel in order to respond to these questions. Okay. Question 1.4. How is the challenge that Stephen Khumalo faces to rebuild his church? All right. So, why is he challenged? Why is he feeling this way? But how is it going to be resolved? Because he doesn't have money. He says it's going to cost him anxiety and it's going to cost him a lot of money. So why? Why is this a challenge? And how is it being resolved? All right. So let's look at our response. It says that James Jarvis is going to offer him this money to rebuild his church because he won't be able to. And remember, once again, this information is not clearly stated in the extract given to you. You had to have knowledge of the novel in its entirety. You had to read the entire novel in order to respond to that question. Right. Our next question says, what does this extract tell us about Stephen Khumalo's state of mind? And it says, substantiate your answer. Now remember, I want you to understand when we talk about people's state of mind, and you're going to say, but how am I supposed to know that? I'm just reading the novel. What you need to pick up on is the persuasive language, all right? What in this text identifies what his mind is loaded with? What is he thinking about, all right? And why does he feel that way? So substantiating your answer means you're going to have to find the evidence in the extract that is given to you, all right? So let's see what is included in the solution. Right, so he is angry or distressed or disappointed as he doesn't want to leave Indosheni. All right, this is where he grew up. This is where he's brought his family. He's raised his son here, and he's even brought his son's pregnant wife back because that is his grandson that is going to raise there. So he doesn't want to leave, all right? And also you could have cited that reconciliation between Jarvis and the Khumalos have now just begun. So he wants to see that flourishing. Okay, so once again I'm going to say, have to read the novel. It is not clearly identified in the text. All right. Moving on to our next question. One of the themes in Cry the Beloved Country is hope. Discuss this theme. Now I'm going to take a minute. Let's just break down. One of the themes is hope. So they're not asking you to identify the theme. They've given you the theme already, which counts in your favor. Now you need to discuss. All right. Now remember, when we discuss, we need to give reasons why we're saying so. All right. So hope. Why are we saying hope? Now let's quickly look at how it is unfolded in the solution. Stephen Khumalo brings hope to Absalom's pregnant wife. All right. Why? He brings her back from Joburg to the rural village, all right? And Gertrude's son, when he takes them back to Hindosheni. So what is he doing? He's taking them back to their cultural roots, giving them hope. Arthur Jarvis gives hope for a future of peace and equality in South Africa, all right? As his writings and the causes he supports. So he's writing about what the people in the village are struggling with and how we need to empower them, teaching them farming skills. James Jarvis brings hope to Indosheni with the projects to restore the land as well as the community. So can you see in all three of those responses, the idea of hope has been addressed? Okay, let's move on to our last question. The title, Cry the Beloved Country, is suitable for the novel. Is it or is it not? Discuss your views. So you tell why you think that this novel, again, we're dealing with a discuss, reasons, all right, motivation. So let's see. The title of this novel can refer to how the family unit is destroyed when people from the rural villages, areas like Indocheni move to the city in search of employment. Black people suffer from racial injustice as they are subjected to apartheid laws such as the Land Act. The migration of people to the city leads to unemployment and loss of moral values, as in the case of Absalom as well as Gertrude. So cry the beloved country, cry, because of the aspects, all right? The novel highlights these aspects of loss that we need to cry about, okay? English superheroes, we are going to take a short ad break. I will see you shortly. Learners, welcome back from your little break. We will now continue with our practice questions, all right? Now we're going to look at questions based on this particular text, all right? So let's go to our first question. Describe how Msimangu displays his caring nature towards Stephen while he is in Johannesburg. Now remember, let's look at our instruction keyword, describe, which means we want some detail, all right? You need to motivate with some detail how Msimangu displays a caring nature, how kind he is, okay? So let's look at what the response gives us. The white man provides Stephen Khumalo with positive information on Absalom's behavior when he was at the reformatory. He assists Stephen Khumalo in his search for Absalom. Also, he recommends to Stephen Khumalo that Absalom must have a lawyer. All right, remember, a caring nature. Okay, so remember in your response, you can use any of the two in which to respond to the question that is given you. So let's move on to question 1.2. Refer to line 12, all right? I do not know, all right? And then the sentence ends with no husband now. So if you locate yourself in the text, all right, it says there's line 10, so 11, line 12 will be there. So let's locate ourselves quickly. I do not know if she ever found a husband, but she has no husband now. So what tone does Msimangu use in these lines? So our tone is identified. Remember, tone is how something is said, all right, the way in which the words are uttered. So in this case, his tone is either of sadness, dejection, bitterness, sorrow, or anxiety, all right? So he says that her husband is no longer there, all right? But she never ever found him when she came. So you can see how the bitterness or the dejection or the sadness would come through in the way he's communicating that, okay? Let's move on to our next question. Refer to line 12 again. Why would Msimangu use this tone in these lines? Why is he using it in that kind of way? So Khumalo would use this tone because what he discovers about his family members makes him sad, which means what he learned, all right, about Gertrude's disappearance did not leave him very happy. It left him feeling rather sad and hopeless and dejected. Khumalo's growing fear that his son is involved in the crime also causes his anxiety, all right? So it is on two levels, because Gertrude has disappeared and now has a husband, another husband, or many husbands as indicated in the text, and also Absalom has now resorted to crime, okay? So that would contribute to him feeling dejected, down, low, sorrowful, okay? Look at the tone words being emphasized there. Okay, right. Explain the irony. Now, please take note, irony, when you say something but you imply another thing, in Gertrude's reason for going to Johannesburg, all right? Why did she go? And what was ironic about what she actually found when she got there? So let's see what our response reveals. Our solution says, she actually went to look for her husband, who went to work on the mines, all right, in Johannesburg. However, she did not return either. She also stays. She also stays in Johannesburg. She doesn't return, and she doesn't write any letters. So which means that the reason why she went is also the reason why she stayed, right? So the irony here is she has to look for her husband because he doesn't return and he doesn't write letters, and she falls into the very same trap. What she said she's going to do is opposite to the reaction that she displays, all right? And there we have our irony question answered. Okay, let's go on to question 1.5. What does this extract reveal about Gertrude's character? Substantiate your answer. Now remember, this extract says something about Gertrude, what kind of person she is, all right? Remember her character, who she is, how she carries herself, how she displays. And then you have to substantiate, which means you have to give reasons why you are saying that. So you need to find that response given in the text. And if you read your answer carefully, remember it says there, she does not find a husband, all right? She has no husband now, okay? But he also says that she has many husbands, which means that something is twisted about why Gertrude came, all right, and what she has turned out to be. The solution says, right, so her character is that she does care for her husband. She was concerned about him, all right? She wanted to find out, but where is he? Where is he disappeared to? So she has concern for her husband. However, she's not strong of character. She's not a strong person, all right, because she succumbs to the pressures of Joburg as well. So that means she's pretty weak in character, all right? She doesn't have the strength of character to actually come back to the rural village and say, this is what happened to my husband. I am now returning to the rural village to continue my life. However, she succumbs to the same kind of pressure that her husband has succumbed to. Okay, I hope this is helping you guys, because these questions are very similar to what you will experience in an exam setting. All right, moving on. Describe the setting of this extract. Now remember, setting, where it takes place. What context is this happening? All right, and they've given you 2 marks, so let's see what our solution displays. It says Kamala goes to Barbara Smith's house in search of Sibeko's daughter. So he wants to find out, all right? Tell me what happened. Why is my brother missing, and where is he and why? And he wants to find answers, all right? Hopefully Barbara Smith will be able to assist him in finding answers as to why his family members can no longer be located. All right. 1.7. Refer to line 2. Explain why Stephen neither saw sight nor heard sound. All right? Why did he not see sight, or let's just locate ourselves there quickly. Okay? So, explain why this has happened. Okay? Now, if we look at our response, before we get to the response, can you see, all right, that this here is a figurative or a persuasive, emotive kind of language that is being used, all right? So let's see what our solution shows us. He is overwhelmed. Can you see that there's our emotive word coming through? And with the grief and a shock response because of the news of his son. He is so deep in thought that he shuts off, all right? So his senses seem to totally elude him, because he shuts off to everything that is happening around him because the news has become so overwhelming, all right? The turmoil and the sorrow is too overwhelming for him to handle what is happening around him. Okay, let's move on to our last question. Refer to lines 4 to 6 with shaking hands, and it ends with of her breast. So we're going to lines 4 to 6. Let's just locate it. Let's go there with shaking hands, and then that's where we're going to find our answer. It says, what do these lines tell us about Mrs. Khumalo's state of mind? Now, Mrs. Khumalo, the wife of Mr. Khumalo, who's lost their son, Absalom, all right? He's now going to be, he's arrested, he's in jail, and because of his criminal activity. So what is her state of mind when she hears this news? Substantiate your answer. So let's look at our response quickly. It says her hands were shaking because it was a reaction, all right? It's a shock reaction to the news she received about her son. She clutches her breast because of the anxiety that has become unbearable, all right? She is deeply affected and she feels vulnerable. So look at the way in which we interpret the woman's body language, Mrs. Khumalo's body language, into how she receives the news of the arrest of a son. Learners, we are going to take a short ad break, and I will see you soon. Learners, welcome back. Let's wrap up our session on novels and how to approach novels, all right? So remember, in our curriculum scope, we are focusing on reading and viewing, and remember, in this case, we looked at language features and comprehension strategies. And remember, this was specifically looking at strategies for literature, okay? Remember, the comprehension strategies for literature focused on the following. The literary interpretation, all right? So that you could have a deeper sense and appreciation for the literary meaning in text, okay? Also, we very closely looked at the manipulation of language and then also showed you how to answer questions based on literature text. Now remember, it's not the entire novel, it's an extract, all right? And questions are based on the two extracts that you have to answer. Remember, our keywords that we focused on in our lesson was very particularly looking at manipulation of language as well as symbolism, all right? What an action or a word symbolizes in that novel, okay? Then, our common errors that we identified. Remember that many learners fail to read the novel that they study, and if you didn't read the novel, you are not going to have the contextual base in which to respond to questions. They cannot identify the building blocks of literature. They do not study the set work, and therefore they don't understand the sequence of events, all right, and how the events unfold in the novel. And they fail to interpret, analyze, and respond to questions appropriately. Learners are unable to correctly respond to interpretive typed questions, all right, where you have to analyze what the question requires. They lack the vocabulary to respond to the scope required by that particular question. All right. Remember, in our exam writing competencies, which means when I go into an exam setting, what are the list of things that I need to have or need to know in order to respond appropriately to an exam writing session? Remember, in this instance, we want you to interpret, analyze, and respond to the scope of literature questions. And I'm sure you have seen how literature questions are particularly set out to target a certain answer from the text. You need to have critical thinking skills. Time management is paramount because you are time bound in the exam room, okay? Reading skills to understand imagery as well as figurative meaning, which means you must be able to interpret the text as you are reading it so that you can respond appropriately. And then interpret the core elements. So we looked at your strategies and we also looked at the building blocks of literature. Okay, so all of those skills are needed in order to respond to the questions appropriately. Learners, we've identified questions that will help you to practice and hone your skill of how to respond to questions about the novel. And we hope this hints is going to give you guidance. We want to thank you for joining us today, and we hope that we'll see you next time.